Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're peeling back the layers on something absolutely fundamental to how we think about work management and, well, even public service.
Yeah.
The surprising legacy of Elton Mayo and the origins of the human relations perspective.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. We've pulled together a really comprehensive stack of source material for this dive.
Hmm.
Lots of notes and excerpts covering Mayo's life, his big ideas, those, famous studies, the impact his work had.
And crucially, the significant critiques it received, which the sources really don't shy away from.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to unpack all of this. We want to understand who Elton Mayo actually was, explore the ideas that seemed almost, well, radical for the time, and really get into what the famous Hawthorne studies actually found. Because like you said, the sources highlight some real nuances there.
Mm-hmm.
And then look honestly at the critiques and see why this history still shapes conversations about work culture, productivity, and well-being today. It's about getting beyond maybe the textbook summaries to the core insights and the controversies the sources reveal.
Right. So, to set the stage, based on our sources, Elton Mayo, active roughly from the 1920s through the 1940s, was this Australian-born psychologist and organizational theorist, and he's widely regarded as the founder of what became known as the human relations movement.
And this is where it gets really interesting according to the sources, because his work was like a direct challenge to the dominant thinking of the time. You had these older classical administrative theories, scientific management.
Very mechanistic views, often.
Exactly. Those views often saw workers primarily as, individual economic units, almost like parts of a machine. Mayo, though, shifted the focus dramatically towards the social and psychological aspects of work. The sources really suggest this fundamental shift profoundly reshaped thinking in management and even public administration.
It's the idea that people aren't just cogs, they're complex human beings with needs that go way beyond just a paycheck.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And the sources trace his background. Born in Adelaide, 1880, he studied psychology and philosophy, taught in Queensland, and his experiences treating shell-shocked soldiers during World War I seem pivotal. They exposed him firsthand to the profound impact of social and psychological factors, especially under stress.
That experience clearly informed his later path. His career took him to the USA in 1922, and then he became a professor at Harvard Business School from 1926 to 1947. Big chunk of time there.
Yeah, and he collaborated closely with researchers like F.J. Roethlisberger and William Dixon, and they conducted extensive field research, particularly in these industrial settings.
Lots of time out in the factory.
Yeah, and the sources list some of his key publications, like The Human Problems of an Industrial Civilization back in 1933, and The Social Problems of an Industrial Civilization in 1945, shows his sustained focus on these themes.
Okay, so what was his core philosophy then? The sources describe his perspective as a functionalist view of society. What does that mean here?
Well, basically, he saw society, and by extension a workplace, as an interdependent organism. He really emphasized the importance of social cohesion, stability, shared values, all things needed for it to function smoothly.
Right, like everything needs to work together.
Exactly. And this perspective led him to reject what he called mechanistic individualism. He was critiquing that idea from scientific management that workers were just isolated atoms responding only to individual incentives like pay.
He really underscored the inherently social nature of humans then.
Absolutely. The sources note his concern about industrial alienation, that feeling of disconnection that industrial work could create, leading to a loss of community, a loss of connection.
And he had a strong concern for employee welfare, the sources say, focused on things like mental fatigue.
Yeah, mental fatigue, that perceived loss of community. His advocacy, really stemming from his research, was for workplace cooperation, genuine employee well-being, and fostering harmonious relationships. This focus on the human and social side is what truly distinguishes his early work from those pure efficiency guys.
Okay, so how did he study this? His methodology.
Deeply empirical. He used clinical and observational techniques, large-scale interviews, massive numbers sometimes, and field experiments. And of course, his major research site, central to the source we're looking at, was the Hawthorne works of Western Electric from about 1924 to 1932.
Ah, the Hawthorne studies. Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road, right? And where some truly counterintuitive findings came out. Let's dive into what the sources say about the key experiments there. First up, the elimination experiments.
Right. This was actually one of the earliest phases, started even before Mayo's team really took over the main research effort. They basically varied the lighting levels in the factory. Simple idea. See how light affects worker productivity?
Seems straightforward enough.
Yeah, but the truly baffling finding highlighted in our sources was that productivity rose not only when the light increased, but also when it decreased significantly.
Wait, it went up when it got dimmer.
Yep. That detail, noted in the sources, is pretty wild if you're only thinking about physical conditions or, how well people can see. It immediately suggested that something else, something beyond just the physical environment, was influencing output.
Okay, so they realized pretty quickly it wasn't just the light bulbs. What do they look at next?
Well, that unexpected result led them to explore other variables in what they called the relay assembly test room. Here, they isolated a small group of female workers, just 6 of them, I think, and experimented with changes like adding rest breaks, shortening workdays, trying different incentive systems.
Trying to pin down what did matter.
Exactly. And the sources note that productivity consistently improved again, but the researchers concluded it wasn't solely due to the specific changes themselves, like it wasn't just the extra break. Instead, it seemed linked more strongly to the group dynamics that developed among the women and the special attention they received from supervision. They felt special, like a cohesive team being studied.
Ah, okay. So the sources point to the feeling of being a special group, getting that attention. It's the key driver, rather than just the objective change in break times or pay. That's a crucial distinction the sources emphasize.
Oh, it really is.
What about the massive interview program? 21,000 interviews, the sources say.
Yeah, that was a huge undertaking. And the explicit purpose, according to the sources, was pretty simple. Just give workers a voice, allow them to express their feelings, their concerns about their work, their supervisors, whatever was on their mind.
And the finding?
It underscored the importance of this expression itself. Sometimes the sources call it ventilation therapy, just getting it off your chest.
Yeah.
But also the significance of feeling recognized and having sympathetic supervision. It wasn't just about the answers they gave. The very act of listening, of asking, seemed to have an effect.
Just the opportunity to be heard mattered. Okay, and the final famous phase mentioned in the sources, the bank wiring observation room. What happened there?
So in this study, they observed a group of male workers installing telephone wiring. And what they uncovered were these really powerful informal group norms.
Unwritten rules.
Exactly. The sources describe strong solidarity among the workers, and they voluntarily restricted their output. They set their own informal quota that was actually lower than the company's official standard.
Why would they do that?
Well, the sources suggest it was sometimes to protect slower workers in the group, or maybe just to maintain a comfortable pace they all agreed on. And there was significant peer pressure to conform to these unwritten norms. It clearly showed how this informal organization, this hidden social structure within the workplace, could actually override formal rules or even financial incentives.
Wow. That informal power structure, often totally invisible to management, is fascinating. And the sources show Mayo's team was one of the first to really document its impact systematically.
Yeah, and the sources also briefly mention other studies Mayo was involved in, like one at a Philadelphia textile mill. Simply introducing rest pauses drastically reduced extremely high turnover rates. And studies in the Southern California aircraft industry during World War II, where fostering team cooperation helped cut down absenteeism and turnover.
So these smaller studies reinforce the same pattern.
Consistently. Social and psychological factors were critical, not just the mechanics or the money.
Okay, so drawing these findings together, the concept most famously associated with all this work is the Hawthorne effect itself. How do the sources define that?
Well, the core idea, as the sources present it, is the tendency for productivity to improve simply because workers feel observed and valued. It clearly underscored the critical role of attention and recognition from management.
And like you said before, the sources often add that nuance, the Dar. It wasn't just being watched maybe like a hawk, but feeling valued and part of a special group context that mattered.
Precisely. And that distinction Mayo's work drew between the formal roles and the informal organization is huge. The sources clearly show that these social structures, the group norms, often have way more influence on daily behavior than formal authority or the written rule book.
It makes sense when you think about it.
Absolutely. And the concept of group dynamics, that sense of belonging, what the sources sometimes call we feeling or group cohesion, was found to be a more significant driver of motivation than purely physical working conditions or even individual financial incentives alone.
So that really flies in the face of the dominant economic models of motivation at the time, right?
Totally. The sources highlight his argument that non-monetary rewards, recognition, good relationships, feeling part of a team were critical motivators, often just completely overlooked by those purely rational or economic views of the worker.
And flowing Knowing from the interviews and observations, the importance of communication and leadership was clear too.
Yeah, the sources advocate for two-way communication where workers feel heard, sympathetic supervision that recognizes human needs, not just task completion, and creating more participatory work environments to boost morale and engagement.
Which is why he's considered a pioneer of industrial sociology.
Exactly. Integrating social and psychological dimensions into the study of work in a way that really hadn't been done systematically before.
Okay, so how did these ideas translate, or maybe attempt to translate, into public administration?
Yeah.
Because bureaucracies are often seen as the most formal, rule-bound kinds of organizations.
Well, the human relations perspective, according to the sources, did bring attention to things like employee satisfaction, morale, and the importance of those informal relationships, even within the structured world of public service bureaucracies.
Even in government agencies.
Yeah. It advocated for things like improving two-way communication, getting feedback, and encouraged more participative decision-making processes, team-building efforts within administrative units, trying to make them a bit less rigid, perhaps.
It sounds like it aligns with some later ideas about collaborative leadership and empathetic governance, recognizing human needs alongside the structural goals. It has echoes in approaches like the new public service.
It does seem to connect there. However, the sources are also careful to note significant limitations when applying this directly to public administration.
Like what?
Well, there's generally less focus in Mayo's work, as presented in the sources, on the big macro structural inequalities that can be inherent in public systems. And there's a risk, the sources suggest, of potentially ignoring or downplaying fundamental power imbalances within public sector structures if you only focus on the interpersonal dynamics.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a perfect fit, or at least it doesn't address the whole picture in that context.
Right. The sources indicate it's not a simple plug-and-play application without considering those unique systemic challenges in the public sphere.
That limitation is a really important point the sources raise. Okay, but let's talk about the other side of the coin now, the critical evaluation. Because Mayo's work wasn't universally accepted, it faced some strong opposition. What do the sources highlight as the strengths of his contribution first?
Oh, the strengths are undeniable, according to the sources. I mean, he caused a paradigm shift towards a human-centered perspective on work that's huge. He successfully integrated insights from psychology and sociology into management thought when they were often separate.
Yeah.
He brought crucial attention to those informal social structures and the emotional well-being of workers, laying foundational groundwork for fields we now take for granted, like organizational behavior, HRM, employee engagement strategies. The list goes on.
Okay, but the sources also detail significant limitations and criticisms. What's the main thrust of those?
Well, one major area of critique, detailed pretty thoroughly in the sources, concerns the scientific rigor of the Hawthorne studies themselves. Critics pointed to issues like using really small, non-random samples in some experiments, like the relay assembly room.
Just 6 women.
Right. A lack of true control groups in others, and big questions about whether the findings, particularly this Hawthorne effect, could truly be generalized beyond that specific factory, Western Electric, in that specific time period. Were the results a universal principle or just a unique outcome of that context? The sources show there's still debate on this.
And there's another critique mentioned that his work had maybe an overemphasis on helping workers just adjust to the system.
Yeah, that's a really key one highlighted in the sources. His work is sometimes seen as conservative. Critics, the sources note, accused Mayo of downplaying or even ignoring larger systemic issues, things like the power imbalance between management and labor, economic inequality, fundamental labor rights.
So the focus was on making people feel better within the system.
That was the critique, yes. That the focus was on helping workers feel better and adjust to existing conditions and structures, rather than fundamentally changing the system itself or challenging management authority in any significant way.
That critique feels particularly sharp, focusing on making workers feel good, perhaps, without addressing potential exploitation or unfair structures underneath. Did the sources mention an anti-union bias angle related to that?
Some sources definitely raise this. The strong emphasis Mayo placed on harmony and cooperation within the workplace was sometimes viewed by critics, like the sociologist C. Wright Mills, for instance, as potentially a deliberate attempt to pacify dissent.
How so?
Well, the argument was it could maybe avert or undermine unionization efforts by making formal collective action seem unnecessary or disruptive. If everyone feels like a happy family, why rock the boat with a union? Mills, the sources mentioned, famously critiqued Mayo's approach quite cuttingly as sentimental humanism.
Sentimental humanism.
Wow.
That phrase, as presented in the sources, feels like a direct jab, implying the approach is maybe overly emotional, perhaps naive about the real hard power dynamics at play in industry.
It's definitely a strong critique. And then there were also concerns, the sources note, about a neglect of broader structural and environmental factors. Mayo's focus was very much internal on the social dynamics of the workplace group. Critics argued he underplayed how external influences like economic conditions, societal norms, the political context might impact worker behavior.
Right, looking too narrowly inside the factory walls.
And again, that generalization issue crops back up. Debate continues, according to the sources, about how broadly findings from Western Electric in the 1920s and 30s can really be applied to vastly different industries or, modern globalized contexts.
So it sounds like the sources present a picture of truly groundbreaking work that shifted thinking, but nevertheless faced significant, well-argued critiques about its methodology, its scope, and its potential underlying biases.
That's a fair summary of how the sources frame it. Yet, despite all these critiques, his legacy clearly endures and shapes modern practice.
Oh, absolutely. The sources show his foundational role in the human relations movement directly paved the way for fields we now take for granted. Modern HRM, organizational development, all those employee engagement metrics companies use.
The focus on emotional intelligence, team leadership, and management training, it all has roots back here.
And those insights into informal structures, the power of the unofficial group, the gossip network, the unwritten rules. The sources show how that connects directly to contemporary concepts like psychological safety in teams, the value we now place on peer support networks, even ideas about bottom-up innovation and culture change.
Exactly. And even in public administration, the sources suggest his principles, albeit with those noted limitations we discussed, influenced reforms that emphasize more empathetic and participative approaches, things that align with ideas seen in the new public service, servant leadership, citizen-centric governance.
Recognizing the emotional and social factors is also crucial today in, say, crisis and change management, right? Informing how leaders build adaptive capacity and organizational resilience. The sources implicitly touched on that by mentioning his work during wartime.
That's a good point. And yes, insights into group dynamics are highly relevant today in shaping effective diversity and inclusion strategies, aiming to build collaborative cultures that harness the power of positive, informal interactions, not just formal policies.
It seems there's also renewed scrutiny, even today, on the original Hawthorne studies themselves, the sources mentioned.
That's right. The sources mention that later researchers have revisited and refined interpretations of the original Hawthorne data. The debate about the exact nature of the Hawthorne effect, what really caused it, how generalizable it is that persists, demonstrating the ongoing relevance and, contestability of his work.
It's fascinating how these foundational ideas are still being poked and prodded, debated decades later. The sources also helpfully place him within the broader evolution of management thought, briefly touching on connections to others.
They do. Briefly mentioning connections, like he shared a focus on the human side with Mary Parker Follett, for example, though the sources suggest her approach was maybe more philosophical, less empirical than his. Chester Barnard's ideas on informal organization were certainly influenced by the Hawthorne findings.
And others were critical.
Well, Herbert Simon later offered critiques, suggesting Mayo's focus might be overly emotional, perhaps not sufficiently tied to rational decision-making processes. But then later thinkers like Douglas McGregor, with his theory why, and Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, they had human-centric views that really resonated with Mayo's. And figures like Rensis Likert and Chris Argyris built explicitly on the ideas of participative dynamics and organizational health that Mayo helped bring to light. He really was a critical bridge figure.
Okay, so bringing it all back together from the sources, Elton Mayo fundamentally shifted administrative and management thought. He moved the conversation from seeing workers primarily as like mechanical inputs or isolated individuals.
Right, cogs in a machine.
To recognizing the crucial primacy of social and psychological factors in organizational performance and worker well-being.
Exactly. But as the sources clearly show, he wasn't without significant flaws or blind spots. His work faced substantial and valid critiques regarding its scientific rigor, its potential conservative bias, and its sometimes limited scope in addressing those larger power and structural issues. But his pioneering focus on informal organization, group dynamics, the power of attention, employee well-being. It undeniably laid critical groundwork for how we understand, or at least attempt to build, effective and humane workplaces today.
So now let's connect this history to you, the listener, thinking about your own work experience. Where have you seen echoes of these Hawthorne studies playing out? Maybe you've noticed that Hawthorne affect yourself. Did getting special attention from leadership or being part of a particular project group, did that boost your morale or change how you approached your work?
Yeah, or how do those informal group norms influence behavior in your workplace? Are there unwritten rules about how work gets done, or the expected level of effort that maybe feel more powerful than the official company policies?
And thinking about your own motivation, how important are those positive relationships with colleagues or feeling recognized for your contributions compared to just your salary or, I don't know, the physical comfort of your desk? Does your leadership genuinely feel empathetic and focused on people? Or does it seem purely task-oriented, just about getting the job done?
And maybe thinking about the critiques we discussed, especially those from the sources about neglecting structural issues and power imbalances.
Yeah.
Here's perhaps a provocative thought for you to mull over that the sources implicitly raise. Today's big focus on employee engagement and psychological safety clearly draws on Mayo's insights about human needs and social dynamics. How can organizations today apply those important lessons from the sources about human connection and well-being without inadvertently glossing over or even perpetuating those deeper structural problems that critics like C. Wright Mills were pointing out decades ago?
Right. How do we build genuinely healthy organizations that value both that human connection and belonging and also actively address issues of equity, fair power distribution, and systemic fairness? That's a complex challenge, isn't it? And something the sources really leave us to consider.